Welcome, nutritionradio.org listeners. This is Lonnie Lowry, a university nutrition professor of over 20 years and podcast host of long-running shows like Iron Radio. Come on in.
Trends in Science.
Hey, everybody. Today I'd like to share a story about a road trip to a scientific conference. I used to write up conference reports for websites, so, why not share this way? The conference this time was the SHOP-23 event in Houston, Texas. The Spaceflight Human Optimization and Performance Summit. It was held at the University of Houston Clear Lake, and it was chock full of space industry luminaries, researchers, physicians, astronauts, nutrition scientists. But I'm getting ahead of myself, so let me back up. Just a few weeks ago, it was too late for me to get an affordable flight. A former student and emerging physical therapist, John, he sent me a heads up about this space health conference. Over the years, we've exchanged grants and, related emails and that sort of opportunities on the topic, but this one was immediately actionable. At a coffee shop the next day, I pulled the trigger. I booked the event and booked a hotel about midway down between Ohio and Houston, where the event was taking place. Now, I admit, I'm a space nerd. Decades of formal STEM education, right? Physiology, nutrition, all of these sciences, the chemistry, the biology, everything that goes into that. Not to mention Carl Sagan videos and books and even science fiction films. They've all made me the closet space geek I am today. By the way, I highly recommend Pale Blue Dot as an entry into Sagan's books for anybody who loves the sciences or is looking for some deep meaning into how the whole scientific enterprise has interacted with human history. So good. Anyway, when I packed a few polos and jeans and climbed into the truck, I was just motivated to learn about the emerging commercial space landscape. This is something that's been really kind of dawning on me, and I wish more so on some of my colleagues, that space is not just a government program. It's a place, and even private industry is getting involved. I just feel strongly there needs to be a much wider awareness that nutritionists and exercise physiologists can bring something to the table in this next chapter of humanity. It's just such a weighty thing. It's not just bigger biceps or running faster. It's literally like the future of mankind. Maybe as I get older, that just motivates me more. In any case, on a very fundamental level, we know microgravity is an utter lack of resistance exercise. It's the opposite of extra weights, right? Of lifting extra weight against gravity to grow larger. It's the removal of a stimulus that we all rely on just to be normal size and strength. From a nutrition perspective, we also all pretty much know that food and the nutrition that comes with it, that's the fuel and building blocks that makes exercise work. Okay, but I don't want this to just be a rant. And rather than write up a big script about the whole event, I'm just going to share some isolated bullet points and facts from the 9 pages of notes that I took at this 2.5-day summit. It's going to be a little isolated and maybe even seem a little choppy, but my hope is that you'll find some of these facts interesting enough that you'll look further online. Google terms that you might hear me talk about from these bulleted notes. Maybe add in terms like NASA or SpaceX or Blue Origin or Axiom Space or KBR. These are some of the movers and the shakers. These are the big players as we move forward in this industry. And it'll give you some information, I think, some understanding of how big this is becoming, this landscape and this industry, and how you might play a role. I'm not going to give you detailed bios on each speaker. You could go to the SHOP-23 conference website and really get some in-depth information there. And in fact, as I look at this, we might break this up over a couple of different episodes, like a mini-series, if you will, here. The first speaker, though, Judith Hayes. She's actually the Chief Science Officer for Human Health and Performance Director at NASA. She spoke about a historical overview of exercise in space. She gave some great info from Skylab to the space station. Here are some of the bullets. She says, exercise is space medicine. I liked that. That caught my ear because for years, the American College of Sports Medicine said exercise is medicine. Here, exercise is space medicine. And when I say medicine, it's the idea that exercise and nutrition, amongst other things, can be countermeasures against this harsh environment of space, right? More than once I've heard Space is out to kill us, right? We're not evolved to live in that type of environment. A vacuum with essentially no gravity, with being bombarded by radiation and things of that nature. So she had a great slide of all the physiology problems, including things like urinary calcium increases, suggestive of bones being tapped, right, and losing their minerals within just days. Apparently, bone loss, you'll see like 6% bone loss versus just 3% bone loss when resistance training is involved. And that 3% came from a talk from another speaker a little bit later, and I'll get to that. But it's also interesting to see that all these fluid shifts that happen in space, you actually have to look very site-specific across the body, right? You exercise physiology nerds. You could end up with something like gains in the skull, but you might have femoral neck decreases. So we have to be very careful and not just look at this overall percentage number of how much bone mass or muscle mass you lose in a month or every few months. It's pretty dramatic, though. Another thing that she touched on and sort of introduced everyone to, as far as the conference was concerned, was this concept of analogs, analog evaluation before actual flight validation occurs. So I learned that analogs were people who volunteered for research that was meant to mimic what will happen in actual space. It might be in some type of habitat, in a remote desert. I'm sure there are all kinds of protocols. But as part of this historical talk, she was talking about how Skylab 3, as I understood it, they had like mini gyms with pulleys and some resistance and whatnot, but the astronauts still were in pretty bad shape. Later, I believe it was in Skylab 4, which was even longer missions, like 80-day missions. The addition of treadmills had improved results for people, I believe for leg strength, leg muscle volume, even preventing some of the weight loss. Obviously, these treadmills, you don't just stick to them from gravity, so you actually have to have a harness, like I believe the Glenn harness is something that's used in this regard, where they have a certain percentage of your body mass coming down from your shoulders and then also at the hips. They have to stick you to the treadmill. Bikes would be a similar scenario where you're not just plopped down with gravity on a seat. You have to kind of hold yourself in position. I've got to think the biomechanics of that changes a bit. It looked more to me like there's more rectus femoris involvement, but it's kind of hard to say. I haven't looked at that data specifically. And then, of course, there's the resistance exercise device, the ARED, Advanced Resistive Exercise Device. This can apparently apply up to 600 pounds of resistance, and this is something that I'm very interested in because there are different ways to lift, different protocols by which you would get that stimulus, that resistance stimulus, couple it with the right nutrition, and try to prevent some of the massive muscle loss that would occur in the absence of all gravity, right, as a resistance stimulus. According to my notes, current prescription for exercise 6 days a week of treadmill, bike, and resistance work, 2.5-hour blocks of time. Now, that all of that is not at a target heart rate or literally in the middle of a rep. It's some build-up and some breakdown of the equipment and that sort of thing, like an upper-lower core split that they do. But I can tell you, looking at that massive thing, it's amazing that they can just transport that into space. I'm sure it gets lots of use, but there's even talk about reducing the amount of payload to the size of a shoebox for the Artemis mission, for missions that, as I understand, can be up to 47 days. Obviously, this is going to be a challenge if you can't have a big device like that, but human beings are going to fall apart without that kind of muscle and exercise stimulus. But I digress. I'm going to have to shotgun some of these things or do this in multiple sessions, but Richard Schuring was next. He was a DO. He was a medical doctor. He was talking about 18 to 21 months of preconditioning before the astronauts go up. A lot of work in the pool to get ready for EVA prep, right? Spacewalks, if you will. I really got the impression from him that astronauts are like elite athletes, which really begged the question for me at that moment. With a move toward getting civilians into space, how are we going to do that when such huge prevalence of prediabetes and high blood pressure and, sedentary behavior, muscle weakness, and all these other things? But right now, the screening seems really very intense. Nonetheless, the numbers I have here, 59% of astronauts have sprains and strains, 20% tendon injuries, 3% bone loss per month, 20 to 30% muscle loss over 6 months. That's a tremendous amount of muscle mass to lose. Apparently that's reduced to 8 to 10% with ARED countermeasures, again with that large resistive exercise device that they use. So it's cool to see countermeasures working, at least to a large extent like that. He mentioned that 50%, 6 out of 12 astronauts in one study returned with symptoms of herniated discs. Now, I don't think anybody believes that just going into space causes that, probably underlying disease, but the fact that it exacerbates that underlying disease is still a super concern. There was talk of 12 to 23% dips in VO2 max in a month, inadequate sleep, inadequate calorie intake. All these things are going to lead to people not being mission ready unless we're very careful and cognizant of it when we get into any type of gravity-like environment. You know, the moon is 1/6 G, 1/6 of Earth gravity. Mars is 1/3. You're going to have to get there physically strong enough and with enough aerobic capacity to function and do your tasks. So he made the point about, you know, the real money question is the new challenge. What are the innovative countermeasures that we can use, especially in vehicles and on longer missions? Again, this is about getting people off this rock. It's the next stage in human exploration. I almost think about space like the shores of the cosmic ocean. If we're going to go, we're going to have to figure out ways not to fall apart. But look at me geeking out. I've already gone over on time, so we'll break this up indeed into a little mini-series, and I can share with you some of the very cool stuff that I learned at this SHOP-23 conference. It's a real trend. To say this is a trend in science is an understatement. We'll leave it there for today, though. We'll see you later. The NutritionRadio.org podcast is for informational purposes only. If you're interested in starting a diet or exercise program, check with your physician, nutritionist, or qualified exercise physiologist in order to make the progress that you need.